On the 4th of June 1946, Juan Perón, a man who dominated Argentina's post-war politics and still influences its political culture today, was sworn in as president of the country. By his side was his wife, Eva Perón. Eva was not a bystander in her husband's career. In the years that followed, she founded the Female Peronist Party, ran for vice president, and became a national icon. Just how did a woman who grew up in extreme poverty become the most powerful woman in Argentina? And why is she an icon today? This is the story of Eva Perón, the woman Argentines called Saint Evita. The woman known to history as Eva Perón was born on the 7th of May 1919 in Los Toldos, a small town in Buenos Aires province in Argentina. Her baptismal name was Maria Eva Ibarguren. Her father was Juan Duarte, a wealthy local rancher. Eva's mother was Juana Ibarguren, the daughter of a local trader who hailed from the Basque region of Spain. At the age of only 15 or 16, Juana had become Duarte's mistress. Although he was already married with a family, Juan nonetheless settled down with Juana in Los Toldos for several years. The couple had 5 children together, 4 daughters and 1 son: Blanca, Elisa, Juan, Herminda, and Eva Maria. Despite the devout Catholicism of the people of Los Toldos, Eva's parents did not initially face much social stigma over their relationship. The family lived in one of the nicest houses in the town. Juana's older children remembered their mother as being rather glamorous when they were young. She dressed fashionably, did her makeup expertly, and wore perfume, which few local women could afford to do. Juana's children were well-dressed and looked after. The only indication of a shadow over these early years is that Juan refused to allow his illegitimate children to use his surname. Although Eva Perón's birth certificate no longer exists, accounts from those who claim to have seen it stated that she was given her mother's surname of Ibarguren when she was born. Furthermore, when Eva was barely a year old, Juan Duarte abandoned Juana and their children and returned to his legitimate wife and family in Chivilcoy. It is unclear why he decided to do so in 1920. Owing to his decision, Juana and her children were forced to relocate to a tiny 2-room house near the railroad tracks. To make ends meet, Juana began working as a seamstress. Additionally, Juana and her children now had to deal with much more overt social stigma because of their illegitimacy. Rumors circulated about the supposedly loose behavior of Eva's mother with any man who appeared to interact with her, even following innocuous engagements with the butcher or the postman. Juana bore these trials with as much dignity as she could, but her children also heard these unkind rumors around town. In 1926, when Eva was just 6 years old, the family received word that Juan Duarte had died suddenly, probably from either a heart attack or a stroke. When Juana tried to attend his funeral in Chivilcoy with her children, a dramatic confrontation ensued. Juan's widow was eventually persuaded to allow the children to come in and say goodbye to their father briefly, but Juana was forced to wait outside. When Eva was 8 years old, she began attending the local school in Los Toldos. Eva's teacher remembered her as well-behaved, but also as a shy student who had frequent gaps in her school attendance. All that her teachers seemed to recall about her was her serious expression, short black hair, and rather large dark brown eyes. The experience of poverty and ostracism no doubt had a profound impact on Eva, who was not yet old enough to fully understand why she and her family were treated differently, but old enough to internalize the hurt that may very well have helped mold her into a fierce advocate for equality in Argentina. In 1930, when Eva was 11 years old, the Duarte family moved to the nearby city of Junín. Now that her eldest children were of working age, Juana sought to help them find employment opportunities that had been unavailable to them in their hometown. Blanca, Elisa, and Juan began working to help support the family while Erminda and Eva were finishing school. Juana continued her work as a seamstress and was able to move her family to a larger house in a better neighborhood. Compared with Los Toldos, Junín was a large city, affording the Duarte family a degree of anonymity, yet some of their neighbors who knew about their origins still gossiped about their background. Despite her family's troubles, Eva managed to make a few friends in her new school. A girl named Elsa became her best friend, and Eva eventually found a boyfriend, a shy young man named Ricardo, of whom her family approved. She enjoyed visiting the cinema, where the price of a weeknight movie was just 30 centavos. Eva aspired to the fantasy and glamour of the movies and soon conceived a desire to become an actress. Her favorite film star was the Canadian-born Norma Shearer, whose Hollywood career saw her play many tough and clever female characters. Eva began to pursue her passion for acting and appeared in a small role in at least one school production. By 1934, she had decided she wanted to move to Buenos Aires and seriously pursue an acting career. Conflicting accounts exist of the circumstances under which Eva left Junín. One popular story claims that she fell in love with the famed Argentine singer Agustín Magaldi when he came to Junín to perform. According to this account, Eva seduced Magaldi and persuaded him to take her with him when he returned to Buenos Aires. Other biographies cast doubt on this account, as there is no record of Magaldi having had any performing engagements in Junín during this time period. Eva's sister, Erminda, told a simpler story. According to her, their mother simply gave in to Eva's repeated pleas and took her to Buenos Aires in the early spring of 1935 so that Eva could canvass the theatres and radio stations for auditions. A local radio station manager offered her a contract and a small part in an upcoming radio play. Eva was jubilant, but Juana was disappointed, having hoped that this effort of Eva's to become an actress would come to nothing, and that she would return home to find work, marry, and settle down. Instead, at just 15 years of age, Eva was on her own in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires was an exciting and prosperous metropolis in the early 20th century, one which attracted hundreds of thousands of migrants from countries like Italy and Germany. Argentina's bustling capital city reached a population milestone of 2.5 million people by the mid-1930s, making it the third largest city in the Americas at the time after New York and Chicago. However, Argentina was badly hit by the Wall Street crash and Great Depression in a way which its economy never really fully recovered from. In just a few years, nearly 500,000 people migrated from the Argentine interior, known as the Pampa, to Buenos Aires looking for work. These working-class migrants swelled the barrios around the city, renting rooms in tenements and living in shanties on the outskirts of the city. Eva Duarte was just one of many hopeful young working-class women recently arrived from the dusty plains of the Pampa with dreams of becoming a star. She struggled during her first few years in the city and was forced to grow up quickly in the life she had chosen. She obtained occasional roles in plays like The Fatal Kiss, though during this she had to fend off sexual advances from the lead actor, who was also the company manager. She left the company and moved into a shared room with a friend and fellow actress. A former co-worker of Eva's recalled that she had had to sell several pieces of jewelry in order to pay her rent at this time. Nonetheless, Eva persisted, and she broadened her professional activities by modeling for local magazines, hosting a tango competition, and even entering a beauty pageant, though she did not win. Another friend of Eva's recalled that she had fallen in love and moved in with a boyfriend in 1937 or 1938. Everyone, the actress recalled, expected that the two would get married, but after a little more than a year together, he had packed up the apartment while Eva was out and left her without a word. Shortly thereafter, he married a girl from a wealthier family instead, while Eva, humiliated and broken-hearted, returned to boarding house life and insecurity once again. These experiences made her strong and resolute during these years. Eva's appearance also changed after her arrival in Buenos Aires. The skinny, shy, black-haired girl morphed into a glamorous-looking young woman. She dressed as fashionably as she could despite her tight budget, wore her hair in elegantly pinned-up curls in the Hollywood style, and wore bold, artful makeup. By 1939, Eva was determined to change tactics. Accepting minor and poorly paid roles had not led to improved opportunities. Instead, she began to visit the offices of Sintonia magazine, one of Argentina's most visible and successful celebrity and fashion publications. As Eva spent more and more time at the magazine's offices, she began to cultivate a friendly acquaintance with the general staff and, more importantly, with the magazine's editor, Emilio Katulovic. This strategy paid off exceptionally well, and Eva was able to leverage her relationship with Sintonia magazine to publicize her latest project. Shortly before her 20th birthday, Eva formed a small production company with an investor and a scriptwriter and began pitching her own productions to local radio stations. She and her partners specialized in romances and soap operas, which Eva starred in over the next 2 years. These sentimental radio plays helped Eva find her niche as an actress. Her soft, halting voice was well suited to these programs. These successes led to Eva being offered roles in 2 regional films in 1940. It was Eva's radio career, rather than her film career, that contributed most to her success. Radio was far more developed and a far more lucrative medium for actors, writers, and other artists in general during the early 20th century. Far more people listened to the radio in Argentina than patronized the national film industry, and there was far more investment in radio thanks to the security guaranteed by the stability of the industry. Argentina's radio market was the second largest in the world at the time, surpassed only by the United States. Musical programs featured tango and jazz music, and each station aired a daily newscast. But by far the most popular radio programs were soap operas. It was as a leading soap opera star that Eva Duarte finally made it as an actress. In 1941, she took steps to secure even greater creative and working independence. Eva's brother, Juan, had spent some years working as a salesman for the Guerrero Soap Company, whose advertising strategy leaned heavily towards radio ads. Juan managed to help his sister secure an advertising contract with Guerrero, and as a result, Eva no longer had to rely on station executives to help her secure funding for her productions. She had now helped to build a company that produced highly desirable entertainment content which paid for itself, and she soon secured a contract to air her shows on Argentina's most popular radio station, Radio El Mundo. By the age of 23, Eva was one of the highest-paid radio actresses of her day, making between 5,000 and 6,000 pesos per month, roughly equivalent to between 1,500 and 2,000 US dollars at the time, or between 30,000 and 45,000 US dollars today. This was a dramatic increase from the scant 180 pesos per month that she had been making just a few years before. Though she had earned barely enough money to survive throughout her early years in Buenos Aires, Eva had continued to send money home to her family whenever she could. Now, happily, she could support her family much more easily and generously. What's more, she could significantly upgrade her lifestyle. After signing the contract with Radio El Mundo, Eva rented an apartment in Recoleta, one of the nicest neighborhoods in town. She furnished her new home beautifully, bought expensive new clothing and jewelry, and began to frequent the most fashionable restaurants and clubs in Buenos Aires. After 7 years of struggle to achieve her dream, Eva Duarte had finally arrived. The summer of 1943 saw dramatic political changes take place in Argentina. After several decades of ostensibly democratic government which, in reality, was riddled with corruption, election fraud, and voter intimidation, Argentina's then-current conservative government was deposed in a nationalist military coup. It brought to an end many decades of rule by rich aristocratic and landed Argentinians who had become known as the oligarchy. Many of Argentina's most privileged class were the descendants of the military heroes of the 18th and 19th centuries, those whose families and descendants had been rewarded with huge tracts of land. As late as the 1940s, roughly 4% of all the land in Argentina was owned by only 1,800 people. This old guard of Argentinians behaved and viewed themselves in much the same way that the old European aristocracy had. They sought to maintain a rigid class hierarchy, which they softened with paternalistic charitable societies, all the while influencing economic and political matters to suit their own interests and reserving access to the most elite institutions and lifestyles for themselves. The coup of 1943 represented a nationalist coalition of diverse political groups, including liberals, socialists, and even fascists. They were led by the United Officers group of military officials who carried out the coup. While the members of this coalition diverged wildly on the ideal forms of government, all of them could readily agree that political and social reforms were sorely needed in Argentina. one of the many areas of Argentine life which saw interference and reform was the arts and entertainment, bringing Eva Duarte into direct contact with the new government. Not only did the military government seek to muzzle political dissent against the new order, they also stressed a preference for a high moral tone in popular entertainment. Radio soap operas consequently became less racy or sensational. The production process also became lengthier, requiring scripts to be submitted for government approval prior to the broadcast. Eva showed flexibility and a friendly spirit of collaboration with government reformers, which probably won her significant goodwill among them. She developed and pitched a program to the bureau official at Radio Belgrano for a program entitled Great Women of History, in which each episode would chronicle the life of a significant female historical figure. The bureau approved the project, which Eva positioned as educational and morally uplifting. Eva herself played several of the women depicted in the radio show, including Queen Elizabeth I of England and Alexandra Fyodorovna, the last Tsarina of Russia. It was during this time that Eva met Colonel Juan Perón. In mid-January of 1944, a terrible earthquake struck the Andean city of San Juan, a disaster which took the lives of at least 6,000 people and destroyed much of the city. Top government ministers met promptly in Buenos Aires to formulate a response. They quickly decided that a fundraising campaign should be undertaken to ease the financial burden of those San Juan residents who had lost homes and loved ones. Colonel Juan Perón, who was then serving as Secretary of Labor, proposed an arts-oriented fundraiser in which well-known local actors, singers and celebrities would canvass the streets of wealthy neighborhoods to collect donations. This would be followed by an extravagant charity gala. It was during the course of planning this event that Juan Perón and Eva Duarte met for the first time. While the memoirs of both Eva and Perón should be treated with skepticism due to their clearly propagandistic intent, both recalled their first meeting warmly and lovingly. Having heard about the proposed fundraiser, Eva paid a visit to Perón's office to volunteer her services as a celebrity collector. The two liked one another immediately. Eva described the day she met her future husband as her marvelous day, while Perón wistfully recalled Eva's beauty and zeal for the cause. The event was a great success, and Eva appeared later that evening at the grand ball at the Luna Park Hotel, resplendent in a black evening gown, long gloves, and a white feathered hat. Attendees at the ball recalled that when the evening concluded, Eva and Perón left the party together. Only a few weeks into her developing romance with Perón, Eva packed up her apartment and moved in with him. One account claims that she did not even tell him beforehand. Instead, she simply moved in and told Perón's other mistress to pack her belongings and return to her hometown. When Perón arrived home that evening, Eva was comfortably ensconced in his apartment as if she had always been there. Juan was said to have not spoken a word in protest or asked any questions. He simply accepted Eva's new presence in his life. To most onlookers during the first 2 years of her relationship with Perón, Eva appeared to be simply his mistress rather than any sort of political partner. They lived together, entertained friends together, and Eva continued to pursue her career as an actress, though with conveniently fewer stumbling blocks to her success now that she was connected to an undeniably powerful man. She became more glamorous, dressing extravagantly and dyeing her hair a light golden blonde, a shade she maintained for the rest of her life and which became a signature component of her iconic image. Eva continued to star in radio programs and secured 2 roles in films in 1944. The Circus Cavalcade, featuring Argentine actress Libertad Lamarque, and a starring vehicle of her own entitled The Prodigal, which, though it was slated to premiere in the fall of 1945, was not released until the 1980s. Eva's marriage in October 1945 to Perón scotched the film's release, which was said to be too sensational to suit the dignity of the wife of the man about to become Argentina's new president. Prior to 1945, though, Eva hardly appeared to be interested in politics. When Perón's colleagues visited his apartment to talk politics, Eva provided refreshments and never volunteered an opinion. This should not suggest, however, that Perón kept Eva in the dark about his political plans. They were clearly political partners from early in their relationship. Throughout the period of military rule in Argentina between 1943 and 1946, Perón's political approach had earned him far more public approval than his colleagues in government. Most of them, including President Pedro Pablo Ramírez, made little effort to reach out to the Argentine people. Perón, on the other hand, sought to win the people's support directly. He was handsome, gregarious, and charismatic, while he also made the most of his position as Secretary of Labor. For instance, he championed the creation of new labor unions, helping to enact minimum work hours, an increase in the minimum wage, and paid leave for illness and vacation. These efforts made Perón enormously popular with the working class, which represented the largest economic swathe of the Argentine population as well as its largest voting bloc. Meanwhile, Eva hosted a pro-Peronist radio show in 1944 entitled Toward a Better Future, which praised the colonel's achievements. Beyond this, Eva largely kept out of politics while she and Perón remained unmarried. When Perón was briefly arrested in October 1945 by his opponents in government who feared his growing power with the working class, popular historical accounts claim that Eva knocked on doors all over Buenos Aires and coordinated the thousands of Argentine workers who marched on the Casa Rosada, seat of the Argentine government, to demand Perón's release. However, in reality, Eva had no control over the circumstances which led to Perón's release. The credit for that feat belongs solely to the Argentine people. The masses of workers who marched peacefully through Buenos Aires on the 17th of October 1945 effectively shut down the city with their sheer numbers. Estimates of the numbers of marchers vary widely, but some historians believe that they may have numbered 250,000 people. Many police officers even went home to shed their uniforms, put on their civilian clothes, and joined the throngs of people in the streets calling for Perón's reinstatement. It was a particularly hot day, and many of the men in the crowd removed their shirts in an attempt to cool off. Peronist workers were thereafter referred to as descamisados, or shirtless ones. Eva later adopted the term as an affectionate one for Perón's working-class supporters. Perón's arrest and swift release under public pressure in October 1945 indicated the growing mass of support for him throughout the country. 5 days after he was released, on the 22nd of October 1945, Juan Perón and Eva Duarte were married in a private civil ceremony in Junín. The couple celebrated a public and much more formal church wedding on the 9th of December at La Plata. Their wedding register featured a falsification of Eva's birth date. Apparently, in order to hide her illegitimacy, Eva had destroyed her original birth certificate and forged a new one, using the birth certificate of a child from her hometown of Los Toldos, who had died shortly after their birth in May of 1922. This birth certificate made her appear 3 years younger, which did not really concern her so much as the fact that the birth certificate indicated that the child's parents had been married. Following her marriage to Perón, Eva also began to discreetly collect and remove from circulation as much evidence as possible of her previous acting career, including photographs, magazine features, films, and other recordings. Only one other president's wife in Argentine history had been an artist of any sort, Regina Pacini de Alvear, and she had been an opera singer, an occupation that highly class-conscious Argentines could all agree was far more socially acceptable than that of a soap opera star. Just 1 year after they were married, 50-year-old Perón was elected president of Argentina with 54% of the national vote. In addition, Peronist candidates were overwhelmingly successful in congressional elections as well as those for provincial governorships. The new government and the Peronist ideology was a strange mix of both left-wing and right-wing elements, both populist and authoritarian at the same time. Historians and political scientists alike have struggled to define it, although Peronism continues to exert influence over Argentina's politics even decades later. At 27 years of age, Eva Perón became the new First Lady of Argentina in 1946. At first, Eva's political work in the Peronist regime was largely ceremonial. She visited factories, gave short speeches, and received ambassadors, government officials, business leaders, and union leaders on Perón's behalf. Most of this early activity represented photo opportunities, which were good public relations opportunities for the regime, but involved little real work or responsibility for Eva. However, as she became more visible in the public sphere, she began to receive visits at her office in the ministry building from ordinary people in need of help. It began as a trickle, with union members and workers approaching her for support against unfair treatment by employers, or the struggling poor seeking jobs, work tools, decent housing, or even simply adequate clothing and food. As time went on, Eva proved to be both receptive to these appeals and frequently more accessible to the people than her husband was. The initial trickle of petitioners steadily swelled to a flood. Thousands of Argentines who directly sought Eva's help remembered that she had taken the time to listen to their problems and had earned their love with her deep compassion and kindness, her sense of outrage at the economic and social injustices they faced, and her sincere efforts to help make their lives better. It was thanks to these efforts that she began to become lovingly known among the Argentine people as Evita. 1947 saw Evita become a much more important political actor in Argentina, most notably during her Rainbow Tour of Europe. Spanish President Francisco Franco had invited Perón on an official visit to Spain. Seriously isolated in Europe after the defeat of fascism, Franco hoped to cement a new trade deal with Argentina. Unfortunately, Perón was still engaged in rebuilding diplomatic and economic relations with the Allies after the Second World War, particularly with the United States, which had suspended trade with Argentina and frozen Argentine funds in US banks, owing to doubts about their neutrality. As such, Perón decided that the political risks of visiting Spain were too great, but Evita determined that if Juan could not go, then she should instead. In order to forestall any criticism, she determined to visit several other European countries as well, including Italy, France, and Switzerland, thus making this into a European tour rather than a trip exclusively to meet Franco in Spain. Evita was received with the most warmth in Spain. Crowds came out to greet her, and she generously slipped money into the outstretched hands of children. During her visit, Franco awarded her the Cross of Isabel the Catholic, Spain's highest honor. Her reception was less enthusiastic in Italy, France, and Switzerland. Pope Pius XII received her graciously, expressed his approval for the conduct of the Peronist regime, and gifted her with a rosary. The crowds in the streets of Rome, Paris, Zurich, and Lucerne had far more hostile elements. With the defeat of fascism in Europe, many people resented the presence of the representative of a fascist government, even one engaged in a supposedly non-political goodwill tour. In Switzerland, her arrival was greeted by a crowd member who threw a rock through her car's windshield, and another crowd pelted her with tomatoes in the streets. The hostile reception is partly explained by the manner in which Argentina was becoming a haven for former Nazi war criminals who were fleeing from Europe on the so-called rat line to South America during the second half of the 1940s. Evita's plans to visit England were scotched when it became clear that the royal family would not receive her at Buckingham Palace during her visit to London. She was deeply offended, convinced that it was a social slight against her. In fact, the issue was timing. Evita had failed to confirm an earlier appointment she had been offered to have tea with the Queen. When Eva tried to reschedule, the proposed later date could not be accommodated because the royal family would already be in Scotland at Balmoral for the summer, where royal protocol would not allow them to receive her. Unwilling to understand, Evita declined to visit England altogether or to listen to diplomatic pleas for a postponement. She showed nothing but relief when she arrived home in Argentina. She stepped off the boat into her husband's arms, kissed him before the cheering crowd, and announced that her heart would always reside with her country, with Perón, and with her beloved descamisados. A summer issue of the U.S. publication Time magazine featured Evita on the cover as her tour made international headlines. The article contained the first public mention of her illegitimacy, a fact still largely unknown in Argentina, and therefore the issue of the magazine was banned from distribution in the country. The article also criticized her opulent style of dress, contrasting it with the insistence that Argentina was a just and fair workers' state. Evita seemed to take this criticism to heart and subsequently abandoned her flashier style. She still favored designer clothes, but chose more understated ensemble, especially from Christian Dior, while also changing her piled-up Victory roll hairstyle to one swept back in a modest and elegant chignon. In 1947, Evita took over a magazine called Democracia, which under her leadership became a Peronist propaganda publication. Although the staff and editors ran the magazine without much daily interference from Evita, They inherently understood what was expected from them, and Democracia reported glowingly on Perón's reforms and printed flattering images of both the president and his wife. The magazine also became a forum for Evita to promote the cause of women's suffrage. Bills to give women the vote in Argentina had come before the Congress several times in the last few decades, but none had achieved passage. When Congress finally ratified the latest women's suffrage bill in September 1947, Perón publicly signed the bill and then promptly handed it to Evita, signifying that the victory was hers. In reality, though she had published articles in favor of votes for women, she had arrived quite late to the fight for suffrage. The bill's passage was greeted with joyous cheers from an enormous crowd of both men and women who gathered to see Perón sign the bill in the Plaza de Mayo. The years 1948 through 1951 saw some of Eva Perón's greatest achievements as Argentina's First Lady. She organized and assumed leadership of the Peronist Women's Party following the passage of women's suffrage. In addition to promoting women's political engagement through her magazine Democracia, she also traveled around the country giving speeches emphasizing the burdens faced by working women and assured them that a vote for Perón was in their best interest. In just 3 years, the Peronist Women's Party established more than 3,000 local chapters across Argentina. Because of her active efforts to engage women in the political process, Eva has been hailed a feminist by some women's studies scholars, but in reality, she had little in common with philosophical feminists of the 20th century. Rather, she publicly espoused more traditional values and dismissed theoretical feminists as women who did not know how to be women. Nevertheless, it is difficult to dismiss Evita from the broader context of a global women's movement towards equality because she almost single-handedly brought millions of Argentine women into the political arena for the first time. By empowering and inspiring women to get involved in politics and winning their loyalty, Evita almost certainly secured Perón's re-election in 1952. Thanks to her political efforts, nearly 63% of Argentine women voted for Perón. 1948 was also the year that Evita established the Eva Perón Foundation, the initiative for which she probably deserves the most credit and recognition. By the spring of the year, she was reportedly receiving around 12,000 letters a day from people asking for jobs, food, money, medicine for a sick child, and even items like shoes, dentures, cookware, and sewing machines. These tentative requests from poor Argentines moved Eva, who had come from such a poor background herself. Most charity in Argentina at the time was organized by the Society of Beneficence, a group of rich and aristocratic society ladies. Traditionally, the wife of the president was honored with an invitation to lead the society, but Evita was snubbed because of her working-class background and her previous career as an actress, though the society's ladies claimed that their real reason for not asking her to lead them was because she was too young. Eva eventually responded to this by taking over the society's funding, which by the 1940s was provided by the government. The work of Eva's own foundation, which she initially established with 10,000 pesos of her own money, far surpassed the achievements of the society. Eva's daily work at her office soon required greater organization. Anyone who wanted to meet her or petition her made an appointment. She would spend a few minutes with each petitioner, listening to their troubles and commiserating with them. One of her secretaries would then fill out a form with a list of the funds or goods to be delivered, and Evita invariably gifted each petitioner with 2 crisp 50-peso notes. In just a few years, the Eva Perón Foundation's funding and assets amounted to roughly 3 billion pesos, or $200 million. It was funded by donations from unions, business leaders and politicians, as well as by taxes on movie tickets, lottery tickets and casino gambling. Some wealthy Argentines complained of political oppression when they refused to donate to the foundation, claiming that refusal invited political and economic reprisal against them by the Peronist regime. Many politicians and business leaders who visited Evita to ask her help or advice were forced to wait their turn, for Evita would not give them precedence over any of her descamisados who had also waited patiently to see her. They also took to emptying their wallets of cash and simply handing it over when they visited her, for she often ran out of money to give to poor petitioners part way through her workday, and would then cajole her wealthier visitors. "Come on, you can afford it. The government gives you lots of money." Throughout just the 3 years of its existence, the Eva Perón Foundation built public schools and hospitals across Argentina, endowed scholarships, built houses for homeless families, retirement homes for the elderly, and helped millions of poor, struggling families to improve their quality of life in a multitude of little ways. The institution employed a comprehensive staff of social workers who organized and delivered all funds, goods, and infrastructure. Evita was never actually required to put in the exhaustive hours that she regularly gave to meeting each and every petitioner and listening to their needs, but it was this demonstration of love for the people, especially the least fortunate among them, that earned her their sincere love in return. Tearful and grateful people knelt before her as before a saint. Eva's confessor marvelled at her compassion. She laid her hands upon the sick, poor, and kissed them, he recalled, even those with lice, syphilis, tuberculosis, and leprosy. When others tried to stop her, or to swab her with alcohol after these interactions, she reacted with anger and outrage, saying, "Think of what this show of love means to them," she exclaimed. "Sometimes," she once remarked, "I've wanted to hit people in the face to make them see, if only for a day, what I see each day I help the people." Between 1948 and 1951, Evita worked at her foundation and political activities for as much as 18 to 20 hours a day. Juan chided her for overworking and urged her to think of her health, but she took little heed. When he begged her to think of her duty as his wife, she replied that her duty as his wife and her duty to the people were one and the same. Though the masses loved her, Evita's critics muttered darkly and resentfully that her method of conducting government business reduced everyone, rich and poor alike, to the status of supplicants, standing before the benevolent Signora with their hats in hand. They criticized the conspicuousness of her foundation work, calling it a wasteful mismanagement of public resources. It also became increasingly clear to party members that only uncritical sycophants were welcome in the Peronist camp, and some began to quietly leave the party. Many of those who instinctively admired the humanitarian aims of the Peronist regime found that they could not stomach the paternalism, the inference that blessings flowed directly from Perón and Evita, the benevolent mother and father of all their Argentine children. These critics likewise condemned the regime for its censorship, its muzzling of dissent, and the selective political repression which Perón and Evita unleashed upon those who opposed them for any reason. Critics maintain that it was the cult of Perón, of which Evita herself was a key architect, that ultimately corrupted their movement. Evita once remarked during a speech at a Women's Party rally that, "The opposition says that I am a fanatic for Perón and for the people. They say that I am dangerous because I am too sectarian and too fanatic on Perón's behalf. But I answer them with Perón. Fanaticism is the wisdom of the spirit. What matter if one is a fanatic, if one is that in the company of martyrs and heroes? In any case, life has its real value not when it is lived in a spirit of egoism, just for oneself, but when one surrenders oneself completely and fanatically to an ideal that has more value than life itself. I say yes, I am fanatically for Perón and the descamisados of the nation." Evita's biographers and other commentators diverge in their beliefs about her sincerity. Some of them view her rhetoric as pure propaganda designed to manipulate support for her husband's regime. Others believe that she meant every word, but denigrated her as an uneducated actress carried away in her own real-life soap opera. Still others believe that her love for Perón and her belief that he was the best leader for the country was sincere. The few letters written to Perón from Evita which still survive testify to how deeply she loved him and how much faith she had in his ability to deliver true social justice to the least fortunate in Argentina. In January 1950, Eva collapsed at a public function and was promptly taken to a private doctor. She was diagnosed with cervical cancer and underwent surgery within a few days of her diagnosis. It was publicized during her subsequent 2-week convalescence that she had undergone an appendectomy, and following her recovery, she went right back to her rigorous regular schedule of political and foundation work. When Perón's re-election campaign began in 1951, he nominated his wife for vice president to the immense approval of all the descamisados. Some biographers believe that neither Evita nor her doctor had yet informed Perón of the precarious state of Evita's health when he made this decision. But by the spring of 1951, the evidence could no longer be hidden. She was suffering more and more regular fainting spells, she began losing weight, and she complained of constant exhaustion and abdominal pain. It was by now clear to both Perón and Evita that she likely would not survive to assume the vice presidency. At the same time, conservative members of Perón's government had expressed reservations about Evita's nomination. If Perón died, they wished to avoid a woman becoming president of Argentina, especially one with Evita's working-class popularity. Their objections may have given Perón an excuse to retract his wife's nomination without revealing that she was dying. On the 22nd of August 1951, the Peróns addressed an enormous crowd of hundreds of thousands of supporters at a rally near the Casa Rosada. When it was announced that Evita would not accept the nomination for vice president, the crowd began to call for Evita anyway. They overwhelmed all who tried to speak. They would not even allow Juan Perón to continue his speech, refusing to be silent until Evita was brought to the stage. In a voice grown noticeably weaker, she tried to decline the nomination, but the crowd reacted with disappointed frustration, even threatening a massive strike should she not accept the nomination. The crowd called upon her again to accept the nomination, and Evita departed with a vague promise to consider. A little more than a week later, she gave a speech over a live broadcast that has come to be known in Peronist circles as the renunciation. Here she said, "I do not possess the slightest ambition for myself other than this, that it should be said of me when the marvelous chapter in history that will surely be devoted to Perón is written, that there was by the side of Perón a woman who devoted her life to the task of conveying to the president the people's hopes, and that the people lovingly used to call this woman Evita. That is all I wish to be." Though her supporters were deeply disappointed, Evita was praised for her humility, her self-sacrifice, and her loyalty to Perón. In the last months of her life, Evita's health steadily declined, and she was soon confined to bed. She underwent a hysterectomy as well as chemotherapy in a US hospital in a final attempt to cure her cancer, but to no avail. Evita lived long enough to see her husband re-elected to the presidency with a landslide victory in November 1951. In the spring of 1952, Juan Perón bestowed upon his wife the official title of Spiritual Leader of the Nation. She died a few months later in her bed at the presidential residence on the 26th of July 1952. She was just 33 years old. Evita's passing was marked by an immense outpouring of public grief. Hundreds of thousands of people stood vigil outside the presidential residence on the night she died. When her body was moved to the ministry building where it was set to lie in state for several days, 8 people were trampled to death in the street and thousands were injured as the crowd surged forward trying to see or lay hands on her coffin. After Juan Perón was deposed in a coup in 1955, government officials buried her body under a false name in Italy to protect it from those who might seek to steal Evita's body for political purposes. Her remains were finally returned to Argentina in the 1970s after her husband returned from a long exile and briefly became president once again between October 1973 and his death the following summer. Evita's remains were finally laid to rest in the Duarte family plot at Recoleta Cemetery in Buenos Aires. Few political figures in history divide opinion as much as Eva Perón. She came from a very humble background in rural Argentina. She and her siblings were the product of an illegitimate affair, and their father abandoned them and their mother when Eva was an infant. When she was still very young, she moved to Junín and then to Buenos Aires to pursue her ambitions to become an actress. It was a tough life for her there for many years as Argentina's economy continued to struggle after the impact of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, developments which saw the country fall from being one of the world's 10 largest economies to become a perennially struggling Latin American nation. Her big opportunity came following the Argentine Revolution of 1943. The new regime's efforts to reach out to the entertainment community brought her into contact with Colonel Juan Perón, and she quickly became his mistress and then his wife. Meanwhile, his political star was in the ascendant, and in 1946 he was elected as President of Argentina, despite an attempt to have him arrested and brought down the previous October. By then, he and Eva were married, and she became the First Lady of Argentina. Over the next 5 years, she rose and rose within Argentine society, becoming an unofficial ambassador to Europe and a leader of the women's Peronist movement. Her greatest work was as a charity organizer, distributing aid and support to Argentina's millions of poor people. Over time, she became known as a quasi-saint, but in reality, Evita was utilizing the resources of both the church and state to build up support for her husband's populist administration. Nonetheless, there is no denying that the scale of her popularity was unusual, and her husband's re-election in 1951 was in large part owing to the popularity of the First Lady, who, for a time, was considered as the vice-presidential candidate. Ultimately, Juan's regime lost support quickly after she died, all too young, in 1952, and he was overthrown in 1955. However, the legacy of Peronism has lived on in Argentina's politics long beyond the time of Evita and even her husband. What do you think of Eva Perón? Was she a genuinely benevolent person whose own background meant that she wanted to help the poor of Argentina, or was her political career a carefully staged-managed part of her husband's rule, one in which she manipulatively used the resources of the state and church to build up the Peronist movement? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.